on supporting existing nuclear weapon-free zones and establishing new nuclear weapon-free zones can feed directly into the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference and provide some positive impact for the deliberations over the next 4 weeks. I'm not going to read out all the recommendations from the Civil Society Forum. They're available around here. They'll be available in the working paper. I'll just highlight some of the key aspects that came out of the forum. I think the first one is that in each region where nuclear weapon-free zones have been established, there are unique political dynamics and issues that have to be grappled with in order to achieve a nuclear weapon-free zone. Each one has had difficulties, and each one has found creative ways of overcoming those difficulties in order to create a nuclear weapon-free zone. This is important because when proposals are put forward for additional nuclear weapon-free zones, like Northeast Asia, or the Middle East, or Arctic, or Central Europe, there will be those who will say it's not possible, that the politics in our region are too difficult. And it's useful to remember that the same things were said about the other zones when they were first proposed. Some of them are quite remarkable. Antarctica, for example. Antarctica is a nuclear weapon-free zone that involves territorial disputes in that land region between countries that are armed with nuclear weapons. Russia, the US, the UK, France, all have territorial claims in Antarctica, some of them crossing over each other. And yet they managed, with very good diplomacy and negotiation, to negotiate the Antarctic Treaty, which establishes the Antarctica as a nuclear weapon-free zone. And similarly in other areas. The South Pacific, for example, has countries which are in military alliance with the United States. One of them, Australia, is still under extended nuclear deterrence relationship. So the fact that the nuclear weapon-free zone could be negotiated despite that military relationship is a good precedent, for example, for Northeast Asia, where there are extended nuclear deterrence relationships. Similarly with the Central Asia nuclear weapon-free zone, there are complex military relationships amongst the countries, but the political will to establish the zone ensured that it was able to come into fruition. So they're all good, I think, precedents. Another key point with the Civil Society Forum was that the nuclear weapon-free zones not only are addressed to preventing the threat of nuclear weapons, but also for developing regional security mechanisms and processes. It is a way that countries can actually come together to have deliberations, negotiations on security issues, and find common security approaches to dealing with those security issues. The nuclear weapon-free zone may just be the start of that process, and it can lead to further collaboration and negotiation and discussions between the zones. The best example of this would probably be the Latin American and Caribbean nuclear weapon-free zone, which has an organisation established, OPNAL, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, where they have assemblies every 2 years where the governments come together to discuss not only aspects to do with the nuclear weapon-free zone itself, but also ideas of nuclear disarmament and regional security. And we had a presentation from the General Secretary of OPNAL, which was very informative in that process. Another key point was that the establishment of the nuclear weapon-free zones are a very positive and practical way of assisting to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security doctrine. On the one hand, they lower or downgrade or reduce the role of nuclear weapons in any extended nuclear deterrence relationship. It may not eliminate extended nuclear deterrence immediately, but it reduces the role of nuclear deterrence. It's a stepping stone towards coming out from under the very holy nuclear umbrella. Holy by I mean holes in. The other, and that's through the negative security assurances which are attached to the nuclear weapon-free zones, whereby the nuclear weapon states will commit to not threatening or using nuclear weapons against the territories or the states in the nuclear weapon-free zones. Another key point was that the nuclear weapon-free zones can provide a positive momentum towards a nuclear weapons-free world. And this was put very eloquently by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon at the Conference of States Parties to Nuclear Weapon-Free Zones, when he said that the inspiration of nuclear weapon-free zones can help us to achieve a global nuclear weapon-free zone. In the declaration from the Civil Society Forum for Nuclear Weapon-Free Zones, we specifically called for the exploration of possibilities for establishing nuclear weapon-free zones in the Middle East, in Northeast Asia, the Arctic and Central Europe, and called on governments in these regions to undertake multilateral dialogue, deliberations and negotiations to establish such nuclear weapon-free zones. Now, I have an apology. I think that our Civil Society Forum did very well in drafting some very useful recommendations. And I think we did very well in presenting these to the Conference of States Parties to such an extent that it will be included in the working paper put forward by Chile, the chair of the Conference of States Parties. But what we failed to do was ensure that some of our recommendations, some of the core ones, made it into the recommendations from the Conference of States Parties to such a degree that we could have liked. In that sense, for example, on Northeast Asia, unfortunately, the recommendations from the Conference of States Parties to nuclear weapon-free zones only talks about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and does not put forward the proposal for a Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. So I think that indicates that there is still a role that we have to push a little bit harder and take the ideas that we came forward from the civil society and the proposals and make sure the governments listen and pick them up. So it's an apology from me, but a challenge to all of us to not just accept these recommendations and resolution, but make sure we push them on the governments. Finally, I'd like to mention one of the very positive calls in there, which was to support Ban Ki-moon's 5-point plan for nuclear disarmament and to call on the 2010 NPT Review Conference to agree to a process to make progress on a nuclear weapons convention. That was contained in not such a strong form in the recommendations from the Conference of States Parties, but at least they did commend Ban Ki-moon's 5-point plan. So there is some resonance there. And finally, we included, I think the last recommendation, which is very important, is to affirm the role of civil society in the establishment of local, national, regional nuclear weapon-free zones. I think what that indicates is we're not just talking about the regional nuclear weapon-free zones, those negotiated by governments, in which civil society can play an important role, but also national nuclear weapon-free zones like Mongolia, Austria, New Zealand, where civil society plays a very important role with their national legislatures, with their parliamentarians, in order to get their governments to affirm in legislation the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And the examples of the single-state nuclear weapon zone of Mongolia is a great inspiration, and also, in a sense, it can be a stepping stone towards regional nuclear weapon-free zones. So I'd like to thank Mayors for Peace, one of the co-sponsors with Parliamentarians for Nuclear Disarmament, and the Government of Chile for co-sponsoring the Civil Society Forum. I think it was an excellent example of collaboration